9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
Hello and welcome to Words Matter, the podcast we do every week. I'm Norm Ornstein. We do it with David Rothkopf, who is unavailable today, so we had to find somebody to replace him who was even better. And we were able to do that with Josh Marshall, who, of course, familiar to so many, created TPM, a must source for everything about not just politics and the horrors we face as our democracy is under existential threat, but so much more. Josh, I want to start with just a mini rant for a minute, and then we can delve into even more. And that is last night, which is, for those tuning in a little bit later, Wednesday night, I went to the annual dinner for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, which happens every year at Holocaust Remembrance time. And it's a packed dinner, very compelling, often as it was last night, for how long we don't know, with some Holocaust survivors. There are only about 1,000 left in the world, and they won't be around that much longer, along with some quite remarkable soldiers in their 90s, or even a little bit older, who had liberated the camps, and many others. And the message was an interesting one, and this is why I'm about to rant a little bit. It was all about the fight against anti-Semitism, ages old, but it was also, as speaker after speaker reminded us, not just about Jews and anti-Semitism. It was about how it is used as a bludgeon against democracy and the rule of law. And those two terms, whether it was the chairman of the museum, the great Stuart Eisenstadt, who had a vision of doing something when he was domestic policy advisor to President Jimmy Carter that ultimately resulted in the museum emerging 30 years ago, but also Deborah Lipstadt, who had been the Biden administration's special envoy to combat anti-Semitism. This isn't just about anti-Semitism per se. It's about the threat to democracy, the use of the term to undermine it, and about the rule of law. And frequently, although this never turned into anything that was either partisan or political, because the room was larded with people from across the board, including Trump's new envoy to combat anti-Semitism, but also about how people often use the anti-Semitism trope in ways that actually are an excuse to undermine democracy and the rule of law. And wherever you're coming from, to me, at least, it was unmistakable as we watch this assault on universities that started perhaps with meaning, because certainly a lot of our major universities did not handle the aftermath of the October 7th assault on Israelis very well. Somehow couldn't find a way to balance free speech with the need to maintain at least some level of safety for students and faculty and stability on campuses, but has transformed into something else. And when you have an administration that talks a good game about anti-Semitism, but has as the closest presidential advisor frequently, over and over again, praised the neo-Nazi party in Germany that has as an explicit goal erasing the memory of the Holocaust. People who use Nazi salutes, people who look like they would be guards at Buchenwald, and who would actually thrive there, including the border czar, as he were, Tom Homan. It just made my blood boil some last night. So that's my mini rant. And obviously, that's one of the topics we can discuss, the assault on universities. Um, but there's so much going on, Josh. I live a couple of blocks from the Ukraine House here in Washington, which is sort of the official spot for Ukraine. Last night, there were all kinds of police cars and motorcycles around the street. Something was going on there. I'm not sure who emerged, but we know why. And we know it is because Donald Trump has now pressured Ukraine basically to concede, to do worse, not only to give up Crimea and say it is now formally a part of Russia, rewarding an illegal invasion, uh, to basically go glide right past the war crimes and to pledge that never, never, never would Ukraine try to join NATO. And today I noticed a whole lot of news stories remarking on how Trump had had ripped into Vladimir Putin for the first time because as Trump was trying to gain a trophy for pledging what he said he would do on his first day back in office, end this war. Uh, Putin goes ahead and viciously bombs Kyiv, the capital, again, killing all kinds of women, children, civilians, and others. And it was basically just stop so we can get this deal done and I can pressure Ukraine to surrender or we will abandon it entirely. So I guess that's a second rant. But talk a little bit about Trump, his foreign policy, what Marco Rubio, little Marco shrinking before our very eyes, is doing, and what you think about. Let's talk about the foreign policy of the second Trump administration before we get into the horrors at home.
Well, I think there's always been something so uncanny about the heart of Trump's foreign policy. We can see there were elements of it in the second Bush administration. There were in with unilateralism and multilateralism. But what you have at a qualitatively different level and it under Trump is you basically have the United States in rebellion against its own global primacy, right? We built this world system after World War II that you can call it the U.S. backed world order. You can call it sort of a soft empire. Obviously different people see it in different dimensions, but the U.S. was then able to get a second lease, as it were, on the same basic arrangement after the Cold War, and largely because as much as it does place the U.S. in a dominant position, it was pretty good for our big partners. Obviously, there are all sorts of things in history of questionable moments for U.S. foreign policy. Certainly, far more in more peripheral parts of the world than in the sort of the great centers of Europe and East Asia, and so economic centers of Europe and East Asia. And we derive all these benefits from it. And this has always been this weird thing that Trump's foreign policy is in a sense based on seeing the good deal we made for ourselves as a conspiracy against us. And combined with that, I think, is a basic misunderstanding of the nature of U.S. power, certainly in the early 21st century, that I think the Trump people see it as we're in charge. We, the United States, are in charge of the world, basically. We run things. And if we run things, why do we talk so much? Why do we sort of work to get our friends to kind of agree on stuff and then do it, and a lot of, consensus making and stuff? We're in charge. So why don't we act like we're in charge? And in Trump's mind, there's a way you act when you're in charge is that you dominate everybody. And that is kind of, I think, everything from Trump's foreign policy goes from that. That explains why you attack your allies more than your enemies, because you're in charge of them, and kind of, everything comes from that. And your point about Russia and Ukraine, a lot of that sort of is downstream of seeing Europe as enemies rather than allies. But it does show there's something kind of unique about Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump. And it struck me, that I guess Truth Social thing that you referenced, where he said, Vladimir, stop. The word was stop, but the tone of the words were begging. Please, I did everything for you. What are you doing to me here? Right? Like begging. And we saw something like that this morning with China. The White House put out this thing like, we're still talking, we're working it through. And this is after kind of telegraphing they're going to fold and pull those kind of blockade level tariffs off China. And then China came back and said, we're not talking. There's actually no talking at all. You have to do this. So it's on the one hand, profoundly destructive. I think there's a lot of our sort of structure of global alliances we really cannot get back now because of what he's done and the fact that the country reelected him. But at the same time, I think we are seeing these actions of profound weakness, and the weakness abroad is reinforcing the loosening of his grip, or at least the sort of the dominating grip he's had for the first few months of his administration, and vice versa. So that's kind of that's my sense of his foreign policy, and how his foreign policy his foreign policy and his domestic policy are very interlocked at this point, and sort of the perceptions of his power.
You've raised a lot of really interesting and insightful points, and I think the one about Putin is particularly, and China. Putin has basically been signaling to Trump, you're my bitch. I can do whatever I want, and you will follow. You're not the one leading here. Yep. Trump's bluster that he is the most powerful person in the world is challenged constantly. The fact is that China, which has already gone out and begun to build trade alliances with Europe and with our other allies and with other countries around the world, has the upper hand here.
Yep.
We cannot get by without the rare metals that China produces. When we head to the fall, if things have not changed, and people go out to buy school supplies, the vast bulk of which come from China, there's going to be another sticker shock that's a little bit like the eggs have been.
Yep.
And all of this will backfire on him. There's another element to this, and I listened to a little bit on NPR this morning about how the State Department has now basically suspended the program involving Afghan refugees. The Afghans who worked with us through that long war, many of whom who are waiting in limbo in Pakistan or other countries to be vetted and cleared to come to the United States, others who are here, many under temporary protected status. And we're talking about sending them back to Afghanistan, where the Taliban will surely kill them. They were people who worked with us, who collaborated with us, who trusted us when we said, whatever happens, you'll be safe. And that actually, in a roundabout way, takes me back to the Holocaust dinner. One of the soldiers who liberated the camps said he liberated Dachau, and he went in and he saw these skeletal figures, and he saw what had happened to them. And he said, I couldn't understand how one human being could do that to another human being. And so much of the thrust of this, of remembering the Holocaust, is trying to inject that sense of decency, that every human being deserves decency. And you think about, one, the larger consequences, as you talked about, the damage here in our relationships with our allies, but even more broadly, is permanent, or at least it will not go away for a very, very long time. If we have another conflict and we ask indigenous people in the country, trust us, work with us, why would anybody do that, knowing that they could be betrayed if they do? Why would anybody collaborate with us? I look at what they've done with the immigration process. It's American Gestapo, hauling people off the streets, taking innocent people, sending them to hellhole prisons and saying, too bad, you're not coming back ever. And you realize that a hallmark of this administration is a complete lack of decency. And that reverberates around the world as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting that there's one of the fascinating and sort of surreal elements of this Abrego Garcia part of the larger rendition to this El Salvador gulag thing is the reason, obviously, the reason, of course, that they got a legal foothold is that the government conceded early on. This one was a mistake. I think we know that as far as we know, none of the people rendered had been convicted of any crime or even charged with any crime in the United States. It's clear that many of them, by various different criteria, should not have happened to them. But they had a unique legal foothold in this one case because the government said in court, "Oh, that was sorry, we didn't even try. That was a mistake." So they got hold of that, and they, as we know, they have dug their heels in, even after conceding it was a mistake. There's an element of there's always been a strong element of performative cruelty about Trumpism, and it has many roots and many purposes behind it. But one of the purposes behind it is as they see it, a demonstration of power, because we can, you will do horrible things because we can do anything we want. So there's this perverse sort of degenerate value in needless cruelty, because it's a demonstration of power, and so much of this comes from Trump himself, because he clearly inhabits a world in which there are dominators and the dominated, and it's very binary, and you see that in how he arranges the people around him. You see it in his foreign policy, and that is something that at some elemental level is at war with civil society and civic democracy. Because we know in a civic democracy, we are not truly equal in the sense that we have different amounts of power in our lives, we have different amounts of wealth. But the idea is that it is formally held in some balance. There are certain contexts in which you are equal. And so, imperfect as it is, that's kind of the thing. And so there are things about his basic mentality, his basic way he wants to organize everything, that is really at war with civic democracy itself. And that's why, he is in this often inarticulate, in the sort of the political science sense way, stumbled his way towards a very, so far fairly successful attack on the sort of the basic structure of American democracy. It's one of the things that's interested me a lot is that I think when he was elected the first time, he was elected and he just wanted everybody to love him for 4 years. Yeah. And he wanted to kind of have the trappings and everything and blah, 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 blah. He didn't really, he had the wall, but beyond the wall and sort of, bringing back the 1950s, he didn't have a really clear idea of what he wanted to do. And then he shows up and suddenly he's in trouble. And like he's having to fire some of his friends, and there's these investigations, and he can't understand, like, wait a second, I bought this company, the United States. How is the company investigating me? And so that's when he discovered the deep state, which those of us who kind of are either in or adjacent to political science, that's something that existed in Turkey, right? And so the interesting thing to me is that as he developed that thing, that kind of his, fleshed out his worldview, you started bringing to him people like Russell Vogt and Kash Patel, all these people who had these pre-existing kind of ideological desires to sort of basically destroy the post-New Deal state, to create a much more authoritarian country. And that's, and when he came back, those people were already, firmly with him. And then now we're getting what we're getting.
Yeah, you're right. The cruelty is the point in part, and that flows from his background. He is a sociopath. His family was sociopathic. I've become good friends with Mary Trump. If you read Mary's really compelling autobiography, her most recent book, you realize that it was there throughout the entire family. Gratuitous cruelty amongst themselves as well as to others. And then you also know that he has been influenced, as the movie The Apprentice shows, so much by Roy Cohn. It is never explain, never complain, always double down on your lies, and never admit weakness or defeat. The irony, to circle back to what you said earlier, is how weak he is in so many ways. We know his role models, and they include every dictator and strongman around the world. Back in his first term, he was very much in love with Duterte in the Philippines, who has now, to the credit of the Philippines, been arrested for what were mass murders, basically, of citizens of the Philippines. We know he loves Orban, but I think probably believes that Orban hasn't gone far enough. Putin is still his main role model, all of the rest of them. But there's another feature of this, too, which is an interesting one going from that first term. He did fire many of his friends. He brought around him in his first term a lot of competent people, traditional Republicans, some of whom left because they couldn't stand what it had become, others who were fired because they tried to abide by the rule of law or do things in a reasonable fashion. And now it's bringing everybody around him who's clever enough to say, you're the greatest ever, I'll do anything you want. And those who know better, like, and this is a great talent of his, when in his first run, he referred to Marco Rubio as Little Marco and to Ted Cruz as Lion Ted. He has an innate ability to suss out the weaknesses in people. And Rubio is at the
which is what a sociopath does.
That group,
who
every day is doing things that he knows are completely wrong and undermine America, but he's still doing it. I've said many times now, his epitaph is going to read, "I was only following orders." But there's another part of this, because the people he's brought around him, by and large, are incapable and incompetent, because the only thing that mattered was whether they were loyal to him. And, back in the first term, I regularly used the word which had fallen into complete disuse and now has no more, Kakistocracy. Governance by the weakest and most corrupt among us. And when you look at the stuff that's going on, from Pete Hegseth to Kristi Noem, who embodies the cruelty and the sadism, but also imagine the Secretary of Homeland Security with her own Secret Service detail having her purse stolen at a restaurant, and whoever did it getting away with it, having not just $3,000 in cash, highly questionable to begin with,
Yeah.
but a lot of top secret stuff. What Hegseth is doing, what we're seeing with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., these Doge people who have no idea what they're doing but are taking a meat axe to things that are going to destroy American health and safety, all across the board. Tulsi Gabbard, you could. It's hard to find a cabinet member when you have the Secretary of Education referring to AI as A1. Uh, you know that we're dealing with people who are not there because they have competence, not there because they're there to carry out whatever the agenda is, however misguided it is, competently. We've never seen anything like this, have we?
No, it does make the first Trump administration look a little normal, right? And to your point, there was someone who said this. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but it was helpful for someone to sort of articulate it. That a lot of the stuff with the law firms, the stuff with the universities, that he wanted to do similar stuff in the first term, but you had I'm forgetting the name of the White House counsel he had for most of the first administration. The guy who
That's
used to work.
Cipollini.
Yeah. Well, no,
Oh, you mean
beforehand.
Don McGahn? Don McGahn.
Yeah, Don McGahn. That as as tractable as those guys were for a lot of stuff, he'd want to do this, and they'd say like, "Dude, you can't. You can't do that." And that they and as we understand it, sometimes they would just say you can't actually do that, or sometimes they would say, "Okay, great, like I'm on it," and then they'd file it away and never talk about it again.
Yeah.
But clearly he has, as you say, he has now put people in place that whatever you want to do, you got it. And that's how we have these. I mean, I've been toying with this more than toying with this project over the last few days, which I'm going to try to sort of pull together, coalesce it, and then hand it off to people, is what I'm calling the DOJ in exile, which will, because one of the things, I think we know that there is, among many other things, we are currently in what, would be most generously called a hiatus of law enforcement as it applies to anybody in this administration or anybody who is working at the behest of the administration or is friends with this administration. It's just, you can do whatever you want, and it's fine. And we are seeing all sorts of things happening within the basic function of the government that are certainly illegal. Whether they necessarily, there can be sometimes there are things that violate the law, but not in a way that has a criminal predicate attached to it. There are a lot of things that are just straight up crimes. There's a lot of corruption, venal corruption. It is impossible to think there isn't tons of insider trading happening against all these sort of gyrations in the stock market and all these kind of crazy actions that, if you had a 10-minute heads up on, the next thing Trump is going to do, you could make big money, as we know. And the idea is to basically pull together a group of people, probably mostly ex-DOJ prosecutors, and then, some researchers and stuff like that, and basically say, do what you would do if you were now running the Justice Department. Because what we need is, I think probably most of your listeners are familiar with this, that it's clear that there's lots of stuff happening with protected private taxpayer information now that the government holds that that is illegal. You can't, people who don't have any need to access that information aren't allowed to see it. You're not allowed to share it with other people in the government. You're certainly not allowed to exfiltrate it out of the government's possession. So just as one example of that, um, we know that that is happening in a general sense, but it would be good to say, okay, let's pull together from the publicly available information. Who are we talking about? Who has violated those laws? Now, obviously, a non-governmental entity can't impanel a grand jury and can't subpoena documents, but a lot of these things we know to a pretty well. And you kind of put this together and you say this appears to be a criminal act, and these are the laws that it would be prosecuted under. And to get that out there, because you have news stories that will say, the quote someone quote some legal expert who will say down at the bottom of a story, this looks like they might have violated this or that law. It looks bad, right? But those things fade away like a single ice cube on like hot asphalt, right? They're kind of there and they're not there. And you bring all this stuff together, and I think that's really important for a number of reasons. One is that it gives the public a sense of what is happening, and it possibly gives a sense of the scale as what is happening, and it also, I think, starts to create some deterrence. Like, Donald Trump's not always going to be president, so like you might face some difficulty at some future point because of the things you're doing now. But I think one of the things that brings all of those things together is that as humans, we need to reconcile what we are seeing in the world. And if a lot of crimes are being committed, but nothing's happening, you start thinking maybe they're not crimes, because when there's a crime, there's an investigation, and then someone resigns, and then sometimes they get charged with something. That's how it works. But if it's not working that way, maybe there are no crimes, and you get this sort of like topsy-turvy thing. No one knows what's happening. And so I think that is actually to me, that is one of the most important things, in addition to filing lawsuits and people willing to run some personal risk or institutional risk to fight the things that are happening right now, that one of the big things is working against the reality distortion that all of this stuff together creates for people, because that's kind of how you get authoritarian regimes and dictatorships and stuff, that you kind of, which way's up and which way's down, what's happening, right? And you people, leaders who are untrammeled start creating their own realities. So that's another, in my mind, aspect of what's going on right now and what's necessary to counter it.
Yeah, that's your effort is really important. Steve Bannon was right back in 2016 when he said, I know our media, and if you flood the zone with scandals, with outrageous stuff, it will all just slip through. The fact is, in the past, most Americans don't pay close attention to what's going on in the world around them. They have their lives to lead. It's only when something gets pounded away over an extended period of time by outlets that have credibility, like the New York Times always has. This is important. This is serious. That it becomes something that people understand and pay attention to. And that was true when Trump flooded the zone with scandal after scandal after scandal in 2016. It's true now as we see illegal act, corrupt act after corrupt act. Trump is about to do something that is the most corrupt thing a president has ever done in the history of the country. And that is bring in large numbers of wealthy people as his president, as an official act, to get them to buy his cryptocurrency. The money will go directly to him. This is selling the presidency for personal gain, which he's done before. We know that, beginning in his first term, not only all the violations of the emoluments clauses, all the money that came into his Trump hotel with foreign governments that would pay ridiculously inflated sums for rooms and food, and then as soon as he left, they stopped coming, to the Secret Service agents paying a fortune for golf carts to rent to protect him, which went right into his pocket. But this takes it to another level. And if we see any stories about this, they'll be buried and no one will pay any attention to it. I want to end with just one other thing in which I'd like your reaction, Josh, because it's related. The Justice Department now is a disaster beyond anything even imagined by John Mitchell and the Nixon administration or any other corrupt administration and presidency. From Pam Bondi to Todd Blanche to the acting U.S. attorney here, Martin, we've got people who are daily both violating the law, violating every standard of justice, and sending the signal, as you said, that do whatever you want. We know from that our safeguards, the institutions, public and private, that we would expect to put constraints around the possibility of a dictatorship, what the framers had in mind, whether it was the check and balance of a Congress as an independent branch with all of its powers, the power of the judiciary, the independent bureaucracy, the independent regulatory commissions that we've had created, and then the social institutions from NGOs to universities to the business community and beyond that are not operating very well. We have a number of judges that are doing the right thing, now in some instances being ignored or subterfuge being used to get around them. We know that our press corps, which is an important part of this check and balance, is basically doing almost nothing. The White House press corps is a pathetic entity, kowtowing to him, bowing down far more, access being more important to them than their fundamental role. Law firms, some universities, far too many entities. What can we do? As you say, bringing together almost a shadow Department of Justice can certainly help. Mm-hmm. Having courageous lawyers and law firms, having universities join with Harvard, a large number of them, and saying, no, we're not going to do what you want us to do. But so far, it's very, very little. And, frankly, when I look at a Senate, 50 Republicans voted for Pete Hegseth, not one of them in the aftermath of this, and they all knew what he was like. They all knew he was an outrageously obscene choice for this post. Not one has said, this guy's done horrible things, he needs to go. All 99, including the Democrats, voted for Marco Rubio. Nothing. We can't count on the House or Senate to do much of anything. And the Democrats, frankly, are almost as pathetic, not quite, but almost, as the Republicans. What do we do to build a counterbalance to an emerging, fully formed autocracy?
Well, as you say, sort of like everything is bad everywhere, as the sort of premise. I guess what I come back to is that this is and always has been fundamentally a battle over public opinion. Yeah. One of the things that we have in our favor, federalism has often not been something that progressives or Democrats, in general, have looked kindly on for the last 60 or 70 years. It's often been used by the right to sort of, kind of block various kinds of reformism and stuff. But this is a moment where we can be really grateful because we do have these separate sovereignties in the states. And it is a subordinate sovereignty, but it is not in the chain of command. There is no situation in which the president can't fire a governor, can't even fire a mayor, right? These are separate sovereignties. And luckily, our elections are run by those sovereignties. Now, Trump's trying to get around that now, but that's a big wall. So there are certain things like that that give me confidence that the structures to make the impact of public opinion real are still there. Now, there's a lot of things people should be doing to sort of bolster that, but that is one big deal. And I think the other thing is that you need institutions where possible to resist what Trump is trying to do. That is why what Harvard did here, whatever one thinks of Harvard, every other day of the week, is incredibly important. And it was sort of I'm not sure that's why they got there, but they have an obligation because Harvard is one of the few institutions that has the resources that it could hold out for a significant period of time through a period of litigation to hopefully be vindicated by the courts, whereas most universities couldn't hold out a day, right?
Sure.
So you have that. You have the University of Michigan doing this. You have him, as we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, coming forward and saying, "Hey, we're going to back Harvard on this." And with the universities, my sense is, I think if the universities all band together and say no, the whole thing falls apart. He needs to brutalize a few universities one at a time. So I think that public opinion still counts, and that is why when we see that when we see Republican members of Congress going to these town halls and they barely escape without being tarred and feathered, that is the reality of where the country is right now. So I think what people need to do is be sort of lean forward into their civic patrimony, for lack of a better word, and apologies to everybody for the gendered language. But this is something that we have all inherited, whether born in America or naturalized as American citizens. And it is an advantage we have that even though it has often been honored in the breach, this country is filled with a civic tradition that is anti-monarchical, anti-arbitrary rule, has all this veneration of the sort of the procedures of democracy and stuff. And that is sort of, as they say in the business world, that's collateral, right? It's good collateral we can sort of use in this case. So I think we all have to lean into that in our individual lives. I think we have to do everything we can to make the case that the things that are happening right now in the federal government and around the country aren't these like procedural little details that only people like you and me who kind of think a lot about government are really obsessed about. They're reasons why you're going to go and try to get a weather forecast. There's not going to be one. Or you're going to buy some milk and it's going to be tainted because they're no longer doing they're no longer doing the safety checks on milk. This actually affects people in their real lives. And then the final point, I think, is to, Trump goes out there and he's doing these things to the law firms and this, that, and the other. I think what is important, you're starting to see this from the Democrats in the House as saying, if there's only one side pushing, that side's going to at least get a lot of what it wants. And so the only remedial thing is to say there's two sides pushing. And right now we're out of power, but we won't be out of power forever. So think about that. Think about that when you're kowtowing to Trump, that we will be in power at some point, and we will not appreciate what you did to the country, and there will be accountability for that. And so I think all of those things are, what we all need to be doing. And where it ends up, I don't know. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, if this sort of the forces of civic democracy are able to come out on top in this, I mean, we're going to re-inherit a government that is like devastated, with a lot of parts of it that have to be built from scratch, that can't be, fixed anymore. But I mean, to circle back to what we started on about the Holocaust, the world has been destroyed before, and there were people who had to live in that world and rebuild it, and these are the things that fate hands these eras to some people, and it is what it is.
That is a rare optimistic note for this podcast.
Okay.
We usually end on the downer side, and that's my doing, I have to say, more than anybody else's. But that is a good place to end. It was a joy to have you on, Josh. Great insights and depth. And we'll do it again, I hope, if you're willing.
I'd love to. I really had a great time.
To all of our listeners and a little bit viewers, thank you again. Please think about, if you haven't, joining the DSR network. That's Deep State Radio, going back to something you said earlier about the deep state, Josh. But it's jocular in this case. We have all kinds of good stuff besides or along with this podcast. So thanks, and we will see you next week, probably with David Rothkopf back. Thanks again, Josh.
Thanks for having me.